Today is the fourth Sunday in Advent, the last Sunday in Advent, and traditionally we reflect on Mary. Mary is a person who appears all the way through the Gospel. In fact, except for Jesus, I think she's the only character who appears all the way through the Gospel, and then, unlike Jesus, into the early church. We hear, of course, the reading we had today, we hear the Annunciation, where the angel comes in the beginning of the story of the Gospel as Jesus is conceived. We then have Mary at Christmas making her way to Bethlehem with our husband Joseph and the child being born. We have her and Joseph becoming refugees in Egypt, afraid of Herod and what he's trying to do to this boy. We have the presentation at the temple, where Joseph and Mary bring the child to the temple and Simeon recognizes who this is. We have then at 12 years old, Jesus being lost in the temple and Mary and Joseph searching for him. When Jesus begins his ministry, at least in John's Gospel, his first miracle is at the inspiration of his mother, who's also at the wedding feast. She appears at various times in the Gospel as Jesus' ministry continues, but she certainly is seen to be at the foot of the cross as Jesus hands her care from himself to John. And then we read in Acts that she's one of the people, significant leaders in the early church in Jerusalem. So Mary is through that whole story, Mary appears. And Mary is an interesting character from this perspective of how we view the stories, how we view what the events in the Gospels. The Gospel writers were, for the most part, as far as we know, were all men. They all spoke Greek, which meant they were educated, and all wrote, which meant they were educated. And therefore had a position of power both within the church and within the wider society. And so quite often the Gospels come in seen as the events seen from those who are more powerful, more influential. But of course Mary was the opposite. She was from the bottom of society. She was not seen as someone with influence or with prestige. We start with her being pregnant out of wedlock, which would have been a scandal. And she's of course assumingly a young girl, and she's a woman. Her gender would have made her an outcast. Later on, there's the inference that she is a widow, again, outside the family, because Jesus is somehow responsible for taking care of her, so there must be no father or a wider family that she's part of. And he hands her over to John for care after his death. So Mary's perspective of what's happening is not from those with prestige and power, but from the weak and the marginal within society. And so if we follow Mary, perhaps we see the stories of the Gospel in a different way, from different eyes. The church throughout the year has various feasts to mark what Mary does. In March we have the Annunciation, the reading we had today, where Mary is told that she will be carrying Jesus. We then have the Visitation, where Mary goes and visits her kinswoman Elizabeth, who's pregnant with John the Baptist. We hear about her during the Passion narrative as at the cross. Once every 3 years, we hear about the miracle at Cana and how she tells Jesus to do what he needs to do. And then after Easter, we quite often hear the events of what's happening in the early church, where Mary figures prominently. So at different times in the year, we reflect on different parts of Mary's story and her perspective of what's going on. So today I'd like to think about Mary on the way to Bethlehem, pregnant. One of the assumptions that the church makes, because we hear about Jesus' brothers and sisters, and the assumption is they seem to be older, is that Joseph had been married before, which is not surprising. Before modern medicine, childbirth was very, very risky, and it was probably one of the greater killers of young women, dying in childbirth. You go back and look at various histories in many families where you'll see one person is married and then dies in childbirth, then the man marries another woman and she dies, and there can be 4 or 5 women who die in childbirth. Childbirth was very dangerous. There's lots of things that could go wrong. And here's Mary on her way to Bethlehem by the way, one of the pictures we probably want to avoid if you want to understand the gender roles in Jesus's time. Mary would not have been riding the donkey if there was a donkey. That would have been Joseph. Mary had been walking by the side. The man would have rode the donkey because he was important and he was the position of authority. The woman was seen below and she would have just walked. So instead of Mary on the donkey, always think of Joseph on the donkey. Gives you a hint of what her place was in society. But as she makes her way to Jerusalem, or Bethlehem, she must be frightened about what's about to happen. She's probably still a quite young girl. This is her pregnancy. She's been around pregnant women and birth all her life, but she knows how dangerous it is and how she might not survive this. She understands that it's going to be painful, no pain control in those days. She understands that it is a difficult time for her. And she has heard and seen, I'm so sure many people suffer great pain during childbirth, and she'd seen people die as a result of it. So she must have been frightened. But at the same time, all these amazing things have happened around her. The angel coming, what the stories that Elizabeth tells about her pregnancy, about how when she goes to visit Elizabeth, the child in Elizabeth's womb leaps because he realizes who it is, and Elizabeth realizes who this child is that she is carrying. So she must be filled with hope. So those two emotions must have been churning up inside of her. Fear, worry, concern, but yet hope and wonder. And maybe at this time, this very special time we're in, and this very weird time we're in, those are emotions that we might want to reflect upon as we come upon Christmas. This has been a scary time. All of us live in fear that we might get ill, that this illness could kill us or kill those we love. It might cause long-term damage. We might be in intensive care, all because of something we can't see. We've had to take great precautions. We've had to change our lives, wearing masks, social distancing, being in lockdown, working in new ways. I never thought I would spend more time online than I did working with other people, but that's the life I live. That I spend more of my services are online than with real people. That's the world we're in right now. And so, like Mary, we're scared. We're scared not only for our own personal health and the health of our families and friends and those we love, but we're scared about the wider society, about how our economy is going to come back from this, which businesses are going to survive, about those who are going to lose their homes or their work or their businesses. And we realize things are going to change. I recently read an article by a sociologist, and he suggested that really things aren't radically changing. What's happened is a better way to see it is that things are sped up. And we're now 10 years on from where we were just last year in changes in the economy and in society. And that those changes, many of them will be permanent and have long-term ramifications. So it's not surprising, like Mary, we're scared, we're concerned, we're worried, because we don't know what's about to happen, but we know there is danger out there. But like Mary, as we approach Christmas, we also have hope. And particularly as Christians, we believe that Christmas is when God tells us that my promises will be fulfilled. All through Advent, we've been reading Isaiah, and Isaiah talks about how God, no matter how bad things get, and how rebellious the people of Israel are, and how much they ignore him, and how much they do the wrong things, God will not abandon them. God will act on their behalf. And we believe that is what Christmas is about. God acting to overcome the evil and the sin and the mistakes we have made. Things we can't get out of ourselves. Situations that are beyond us. God is faithful and will act. Now, we'll talk about this as Christmas, but perhaps the last thing we expect, the solution to all the problems we face in the world, is a baby. But that's God's solution. And we must be aware that while we have hope, we also must understand that we don't think like God does. And that part of what we need to be aware of is what God is doing, not what we think God should do. I'll repeat that. We should be aware of what God is doing, not thinking what we think God should do. So as we approach Christmas, we do, particularly at this time, are fearful, are worried, are confused. So was Mary. But because of all that had happened, and because of all that God has done for us so far, we are also hopeful that out of this, maybe good can come. Out of this, perhaps we will find new values, new hopes, new ways of doing things that could make life better. The choice is ours. Do we want to just be people who live in fear? Or do we want to hold on to that hope, but also be the people who make that hope real? And that's ultimately what Mary is. When Mary, the angel, comes to Mary and says, "You're about to have a child," I believe deep in my heart that she could have said, "No, not me." But she knew who this was and knew that with her cooperation, God could do amazing things. And the same for us. When God comes to us, as he comes as a baby,